Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Loins of History. I'm Colin, and I'm joined by my co host, Jay. This is episode 3 of our series on American political foundations, and we're continuing our coverage on the U.S. Constitution this week, where we'll be discussing what the Constitution says about our property rights. So, this is a really important topic, and before we get into that, I just want to go over a couple of quick takeaways that we've covered before. From the Constitution and the other founding documents, we want to be sure that you understand that there are roots in natural law, which is an appeal to a higher power, essentially creating inalienable rights that we have because these rights are not derived from a government entity. They're derived from the creator. So a government cannot take them away. And in order to protect them, people have to consent to whatever powers they give to the government. There's also a separation of powers with checks and balances that prevent tyranny through means that may seem legitimate at the time. You know, founders talk about majority-minority tyranny that can be voted into the legislative powers. You know, like I think John Adams gave the example of Holland and his thoughts on government that we've spoken about. And then finally, within the Constitution, there's actual rules for how the government works and how it's set up. Everything from the different branches, so the judicial, the executive, and the legislative, to how the legislative set up, the process for amendments, things like that. So that's what we've covered. And now we're going to transition to property rights. So Jay, can you tell me why property rights are important?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. So we decided to take our next episode and cover property rights, primarily because there's some things in the world right now where it's probably worthwhile to talk about why property rights are important, and we'll
Hmm.
cover that here in a little bit. But one of the main reasons why property rights are so important is because they serve as the foundation for all other rights. And let I'll flesh that out a little bit. It is You can think of a right as something that belongs to you, right? So in a sense, you can think of your rights, our right to free speech, our right to freedom of assembly, our right to freedom of the press, like our right of freedom of expression, you name it. All of these rights, they belong to us in a very real sense. And it's safe to think of them as our property. It's something that we own. It's something that belongs to us. James Madison, who is the author of the U.S. Constitution, said, "As a man is said to have a right to his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights." And what he means by that is our rights are our property. So it's helpful for our listeners to understand at the beginning, we're not merely talking about land or our house or our guns or you name it, a physical thing that we look at. We're also talking about the more conceptual rights in general.
You know, if a government entity, if the legislative, the executive, whatever, if a government can take away your property, that means that they're able to take away your rights. So if they can come in and say, hey, you know what? We've just decided that this land is ours. Sorry. They can come in. You have now opened yourself up that they can come in and take any right because they can take away the most fundamental of your rights, and that is your property, your right to own something. And
Right.
yeah, like you said, it's not just my land or my guns. It can be your ideas, your money. You know, your property extends further than just the area of land that you reside on, and
Right.
that is important. And I mean, I think property rights are also important because they give you a vested interest in the way the government operates. You know, you've heard the expression that nobody cares about your no nobody's going to spend your money as wisely as you spend your money, and nobody's going to care about it as much. The same thing is with your property, your rights. If you forfeit those, um, to a government entity, you essentially have no property. You are not going to have as much of a vested interest in that government.
Every everyone should be concerned about property rights, regardless of what their physical property situation is. Again, we're not just talking about a house on a piece of land. We're talking about all of our rights, right? The Because property rights serve as the foundation for all other rights. We want the so we the people have written into the Constitution certain circumstances in which the government can take away someone's rights. The most obvious one is that uh, the idea of capital punishment. If in the event someone commits a crime, they forfeit some of their rights. And the government can arrest them, imprison them, and in certain states, even execute a person for certain crimes and deprive them of their right to life. Right. So we're not trying to advocate don't ever let the government take your property, because if they take your property they'll take your rights. Like, no, we're going to go into the nuances in which, under those certain circumstances in which the government can take away your rights. But to introduce the topic, it's important to remember property rights are the foundation of all of our other rights.
That's good. And to your point, and like we said in the intro, there's a separation of powers and checks and balances to prevent either one of those things from happening, like the government coming in and just saying we're going to take this without due process. So that part of that due process is the separation of powers. So if a legislative body passes laws that, let's say, would potentially deprive you of your life, liberty, or property, there are other checks and balances like the judiciary branch who can have a ruling on that law that may have been passed through the appropriate means, but it infringes upon your life, liberty, or property.
The second thing that I wanted to bring up on why property rights are important is because property rights are the foundation of all other rights, it's important that we take them very seriously.
Property rights are important because, like I said earlier, it gives you a vested interest in your government and your own liberty. How can you best utilize the gifts, the talents, the liberties that you have if you have no property and no means to do it? If you don't own the land you sit on, the money in your bank account, the intellectual property that you possess, how can you best make use of them? So, like I said, you are going to be the best steward of that property. If you don't own it, how are you going to best put it in use? How can you have a efficient society, a free society, one that is constantly improving, if you don't actually own it? Because you are the best steward of it, and if you don't own it, you're likely not going to make the best use is not going to be made of those properties.
No, and that's actually a good segue to the second thing that I wanted to bring up, and that is property rights are the fundamental distinction between capitalism and socialism. And I bring this up because I truly believe there is no possible world in which the US Constitution allows a communistic or a socialistic kind of society, much less a kind of government. And the main reason why is that the Constitution, and we'll get into the details here in a little bit, the Constitution protects property rights. And if you take communist theory in particular at face value, it is completely antithetical to the ownership of private property. Karl Marx himself, in the Communist Manifesto, said the theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence: the abolition of private property. And we're bringing this up because, again, if we agree on the premise that property rights are the foundation for all of our other rights, if we abolish the right to private property, we have effectively said we give up to the government the ability to take away all of our rights. And therefore, if we have any rights, they have been given to us by the government, as opposed to the way that things are currently written under the Constitution. That is certain inalienable rights have been given to us by God, by the Creator, in nature. So this idea that, again, the Constitution being rooted in natural law, as Colin discussed earlier, our rights don't come from the government. The Constitution doesn't grant us our rights. Rather, the Constitution restricts government from taking away our already given rights. So, if we abolish private property, we have effectively said we have no rights except those that have been given to us by the government.
Yeah, and once you consent to that, to the government being the arbiter of property, and you give up your ownership, it's very hard, if not impossible, to regain those rights. So it is very important for citizens to be aware of this kind of tyranny. And, I think with communism, a lot of that can be packaged as tyranny through benevolence. It's for the greater good. You need to submit yourself as an individual and your rights to the greater good. Think about these others and you need to help them. Well, that is great on paper and it's great as an idea, but in reality, it's just tyranny through benevolence. It is packaged as you're going to help other people, but we are going to strip you of your rights. And suddenly you are now at the mercy of a government by which you have no say. And they can dictate your rights and they can change them at a whim. So it's very
Right.
important that you are guard against that.
Right. And I didn't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of, communism in this episode, but just to kind of lend or to help our listeners understand, like, the property rights are an incredibly important topic. We didn't want to go too much further down our series on American political foundations without talking about them in the Constitution.
It's a good contrast, that's a really good contrast though, just to communism to the US Constitution. So yeah, we're not going too
Right.
far, but it is a good contrast. Let's bring it back to the Constitution and what it actually has, what it says about property rights. So within the Fifth Amendment, there is what's called the Takings Clause. So no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Did you want to say something on that or?
Yeah. So the Constitution protects property rights in two places. In the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. We're going to focus on the Fifth Amendment because the 14th Amendment essentially says the same thing as the Fifth. It's just in a slightly different context. Like Colin said, the Fifth Amendment basically says the government cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. There's a few presuppositions there, and the first one is that you already have a right to private property, and this amendment goes, you already have it, and here are the circumstances. Here are the only circumstances in which the government can take it from you. Primarily, two things: due process of law, and secondly, just compensation. So the government cannot arbitrarily take your private property because it already belongs to you.
And the only way that they can, we say without just compensation, immediately my mind goes to eminent domain. So, if the government can come in and, different local, somebody can come in and say, this house is condemned, it's unfit to live in, or we're trying to build a highway. We need, that's the one you see most often. We've got to expand this road. And, that is a power delineated to the government. It's part of infrastructure. We need to expand this road. We're going to have to take some of your property in order to do it. And then it needs to be justly compensated. So the owner of that property has to be paid by the government in order for it to be constitutional and for them, their rights to be protected. And if it's not, there is a means by which a property owner can rectify a grievance against the government. So, when we have these laws that are passed or a government agency comes in and says, this is ours now through eminent domain, they can say, well, hey, I wasn't justly compensated. I want to use the judiciary as an avenue to rectify this and say, you actually owe me more money or you can't take this. And there's a number of Supreme Court cases where private property owners, um, sought more damages than they were initially compensated. The only issue I have with the judiciary branch is not really the judiciary branch. It's just that avenue can take a long time, and it can cost a lot of money. If you've never been involved in the American legal system, it can be very expensive and very time consuming. So, one of the issues that I have right now with seeking, just compensation through the judiciary, or if you feel wronged, is it can take a long time, like over a decade potentially. I know there was one Supreme Court case where it was like 15 years after the fact that it finally got to the
Wow.
Supreme Court, and I'll look it up in just a minute when I'm done with my spiel. But it took 15 years, and if you think about the appeals process and the courts it would have to go through in order to make it to the Supreme Court, that can be very expensive to the point which you may not see, your damages may not be realized. And it's almost a matter of principle at that point. And most property owners are not going to go through that fight. So if I had one critique right now, it would be that it is very difficult sometimes, if you have not been justly compensated, to fix that wrong. Sorry, that
Yeah.
was a long tangent for me to give a little bit of a criticism of there
No,
of something
no,
that
it's fine.
is part of our system.
Well, it's funny because yes, in a sense, there's an eminent domain case is not criminal court. So when we talk about the right to a speedy trial, that that's more in terms of like you've had charges pressed against you. But I actually think it's a good thing that it takes the government that long. Yes, it's painful. That's probably for that particular instance. Uh, 15 years to take someone's property. But at the other time, that just shows you how difficult it is for the government to take away somebody's rights. Like we've intentionally built into our system checks and balances to where the government can't just and let's be specific here. When we say the government, what we're really talking about is either a single or a very small group of either elected or unelected bureaucrats, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, like, that's just what they do. They're government officials, and they can decide, depending on the level of where they're at, to take property, specifically in the case of a eminent domain. Uh, so it's not always. I know for that specific person, that's miserable. And if that person could listen to me right now, they would be like, "Forget that! Like that was the worst 15 years of my life." Like, blah blah
They
blah.
may they may pass away. They may die by the time it makes it to the Supreme Court.
Right, right. But generally speaking here,
Generally
uh
speaking, yeah.
yeah, generally speaking here, it's a good thing that it takes that long for bureaucrats to take away something that belongs to you.
Well,
Um
and it's funny you say unelected officials and the power to make decisions, because the Supreme Court, as a matter of fact, 2 weeks ago had came out with a decision that stripped a lot of the powers away from the EPA, which
yep.
was one of, believe it or not, one of the most powerful government bodies. These unelected officials, and it's kind of funny to think about the EPA being that powerful. But if you want to shut something down, just call the EPA and they will find a way. They will find an endangered species on your land. They will run tests, and they can delay or shut things down very quickly. And they had those
Yeah.
powers for a long time, and the Supreme Court ruled against them, and it stripped away a lot of their authority.
Yeah. And again, like I mentioned in our last episode, the regardless of one's opinion about the importance of the fight against climate change, because that's really the emotional concern here is like, we're not going to be able to do anything against climate change. And without agreeing or disagreeing with that notion, the the real issue that we're trying to get at here is, do we want to empower the federal government which the vast majority of which is unelected positions, and not even appointed, they're just hires, right? Uh, do we want the federal government to, specifically the executive branch, to empower itself to do things to which it is not accountable to the people on a continual basis? You know, the left might be very upset that the EPA can't do its job as effectively anymore, but let's reframe this and put Goebbels in charge of environmental protection agency, and Joseph Goebbels determines that Jews are the biggest threat against climate change. Which crazier things have been said, by the way. And all of a sudden it's like, whoa, 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 like, we don't agree with that. It's like, see, that's the whole point here, is that it doesn't matter so much if you agree or disagree with climate change. It matters, do we want to empower the federal government to do things without being accountable to the people?
Accountability it is the key word right there.
Right.
How am I going to, outside of the judiciary, go to an appointed official and say, I disagree with the decision that you made? It's like, well, I've been appointed. And we've said it before. We have consent. If we don't hold our elected officials as a continuous check against their power, they can't, they've done it. They'll appoint people who have this authority that's been given to them. And before you know it, suddenly you can't do certain things because this appointed official is making a decision and you have no way to hold them accountable outside of holding your elected officials accountable. So, and that can take years. And you're right. You don't want to give up a power to somebody that is not accountable, because one day the shoe's going to be on the other foot and you're not going to like the decision, and you've already consented. And like we said time and time again, once you give those rights up, it is incredibly hard, if not impossible, to get them back.
Yeah. So to talk about another presupposition that's in specifically the Fifth Amendment is this idea of justice. It is explicitly referenced here in the Fifth Amendment when it says, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." That word "just" there is an appeal to what a common understanding of justice, right? When the Constitution was written, the idea of what is justice, like, it was, I'm sure if we had a bunch of incredibly smart philosophers listening to us, they'd probably come out of the woodwork and be like, well, actually, blah, blah. And I invite that and welcome that. But the discussion about what is justice in the 1700s was woefully different than the conversation that we have about justice today. And to sum all that up, we live in a post John Rawls world where justice, to probably the majority of Americans, means fairness, right? So John Rawls wrote a book back in the 70s called A Theory of Justice. Not going to go too much into detail, but John Rawls basically uh, captured into words better than anybody else before where the modern understanding of justice was drifting, and that was justice as fairness, i.e., would we do to someone else the as we would have it done to ourselves, right? And he kind of put this thought experiment forward as, if we could recreate the world, uh or create the world that we wanted to live in, would we advantage other people, or would we create a world in which everybody is on equal ground? I'm butchering this, by the way. But the idea is, we would create a world that would seem most fair to everyone, and that's his idea of justice, right? Here's the problem with that. One, fairness is incredibly arbitrary, right? Uh, what's fair to one person is not fair to another. and advantages and disadvantages. It's a great thought experiment, but applied to reality is nearly impossible. To kind of contrast that with where our founders, when they were writing the Constitution, more where they were coming from, was essentially this idea of justice defined by Thomas Aquinas, which Thomas Aquinas, really digging deep here on the loins of history. Thomas Aquinas defined uh, justice really as getting what you deserve, right? The difference between those two, justice as getting what you deserve and justice as fairness, is fairness isn't really what you deserve. Fairness is what seems appropriate and equal amongst everyone, right? Regardless of whether or not you deserve one thing or another. Bringing this back to the Fifth Amendment here, when it talks about property rights and that property cannot be taken without just compensation, I'm just trying to make the point that the Fifth Amendment and the Constitution recognizes that your property belongs to you. And in order for the government to take that property, they have to give you something in return if you haven't committed a criminal act, right? Whereas a criminal act, you've essentially taken from society, and now society is going to give you what you deserve, right? Just compensation is where I grew up. Nearly all cases that I heard about, and I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know if with certainty here, but most cases that we heard about, eminent domain was exercised in simply widening the road, right?
Right.
And it was, we were talking about an instance of we're shaving off feet from your property, not taking your property on the whole. Um, and hey, if the government takes this property, they have to give you the fair market value of the foot strip, foot wide
Hmm.
strip of property that's in front of your house. But again, to kind of bring this all together here, the idea is that your property belongs to you. And in order for the government to take it, it has to give you something in return. If we define justice as fairness, that's not necessarily the case. It could be, but that's not defined. And that's kind of where I get back to the arbitrariness, if that's a word. Yeah, the arbitrariness. Maybe maybe the government goes like, yeah, it seems fair to give you $100. You weren't making any money from this property.
Hmm.
Uh, we're not inhibiting your ability to access your property, but fair market value is $1,000, and we're we're poor here, so here's $100. You know what I mean? So it's like we get into a dangerous world. And yes, I am disagreeing with Rawls's definition of justice here. Uh, and oh, by the way, Rawls has faced significant criticism, just to throw this out there, so much so that he had to put a proviso out there to basically caveat his own definition of justice. But that's neither here nor there. To say justice is fairness, it is emotionally satisfying. It is incredibly difficult and problematic to apply in practice.
Well,
Uh,
here's an example that in practice, you're talking about an eminent domain. Let's say that the government needs to build a bridge, and in order to build a bridge, they have to level. And we're not just talking. We won't talk about feet for the purposes of this example, but they have to level two homes, and one of the homes is condemned. No one lives there. The property is trash, for more lack of a better term. It's decrepit, it's decayed, it's condemned. The other is a home that someone lives in. Now, if we were to say fairness, both of those people should receive, both property owners should receive the exact same compensation, but what they deserve is something different. So just compensation would not necessarily be an equal amount given to those two separate property owners. um, the person that was living in their home, whose home was well taken care of and had a higher market value, would deserve to receive more compensation, and that would be considered just. The person whose property is condemned doesn't deserve as much money. So I don't know. What do you think of that practical example? Maybe that.
Yeah.
simplifies it.
Honestly, all I could think about was like, yeah, but that's still arbitrary.
Yeah.
Like, and again, I'm not trying to, say I'm not trying to put things in so black and white. Like, there's room for debate, there's room for discussion. And again, while I was listening to you talk, you said market value, whereas before I think I said fair market value, which just shows this Rawlsian idea of justice as fairness is so infected that I even disagree with it, and I still use terms that are
Well, were you
consistent. Like,
looking up the
oh, what's
market value on
fair?
Zillow or Redfin?
Yeah, like the
Which website were you using? Yeah, no, I, and that's the thing. It's not going to be. I think what we're also kind of beating around the bush is it's not necessarily going to be perfect. This idea
yeah,
that you're going to receive the perfect dollar amount, and this is exactly. It's going to be close enough where we're not. An injustice would be the person whose home they lived in and was well taken care of receives no compensation, or there's no money,
right,
or it is so abysmally low that they are not able to go and get um, a residence that is equal in value, if that makes sense.
right, right. Yeah. So the last note that I'd like to make on what the Constitution actually says about property rights is it's only in two amendments, which is an interesting thought because we've spent this entire episode talking about how it's the foundation for all other rights. But
Hmm.
kind of caveating off of this idea of justice, what I was referring to earlier, specifically how what the founders thought of justice as this Thomistic idea of justice. The reason why it's not in the first part of the Constitution was because it was understood, right? They did nobody was even again, nobody James Madison, Thomas Jefferson had never read John Rawls, right? the this is again pre a lot of the discussions that we have today. It was understood at their time. But kind of what we were referring to in our last episode, the the momentum of where the nation was during the time of ratifying the Constitution was we had a very weak government. Therefore, the pendulum was swinging in the direction of we want to build up a strong government. That's why we have the Bill of Rights, because there was a group of individuals, a very wise group of individuals who under the anti-federalists who understood, oh, we agree that we need a stronger government, but here's some additional checks and restrictions upon the government. And we are going to explicitly say in two places, the Fifth Amendment when it comes to the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment later, which again, just to remind our listeners, the 14th Amendment was one of the three constitutional amendments that was affirmed after the Civil War. And if you recall, once slaves had been freed, there were a lot of property issues, particularly in the South, with regards to who actually owned the land, et cetera, et cetera. So in the Bill of Rights in the Fifth Amendment, and then later on post in the Reconstruction era in the 14th Amendment, uh, the these people wanted to explicitly say, hey, we don't want to take what was understood in the original Constitution. We want to make sure this is in the Bill of Rights, and later on, we want to reaffirm this. So, yeah, that was
Yeah,
that was the last point I wanted to make.
I think it was the anti-federalists, but a large part of that, one of the states that was really pushing for that was New York. So the largest state at the time.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, can you imagine if 12 of the 13 states ratified it, but New York was like, you know what? We don't have this Bill of Rights, and that's what we want to make sure that it's protected. It's like, well, what are we going to have suddenly a state in the middle of the 13 colonies that's the most populous? That's like, actually, I'm not really going to be part of this. So it is important. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
and that's was part of some of the compromises that were made. It was like, well, we need New York to be. They are they're
right,
the largest state and they're right in the middle. It's a very strategic location. We can't have a nation without them. So
right,
it was very important that they were part of it. And the Bill of Rights was added partly to appease the anti-federalists. And I think it was the state of New York that was really pushing this as well. So all that being said, like Jay and I have I feel like talked enough about private property is foundational to all our other rights. The Constitution explicitly protects it in the Fifth and 14th Amendments. And it is important that we remember why we have private property, how it is protected, and the means we have to just rectify a grievance. And it's important not just for Americans, but for people worldwide to understand and use this as a reference in their grievances against their governments for private property. Look at what's happening in the Netherlands right now. And the Dutch farmers have a grievance because, and I'm going to summarize a lot of what's happening right now. I know there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of updates. It's happening very quickly. These Dutch farmers are basically being told by their government that you can no longer continue with farming because the EU has set a goal, and we as a country have set a goal to reduce our emissions. And we believe that you are a great contributor to that. And you can no longer farm on the land that you have. And we are actually going to deprive you of your livelihood and property in order to meet these climate goals. And by American standards, we would say, yeah, they have a definite grievance. They have a legitimate reason to seek justice. But what Jay and I are going to talk about in the next couple points is, well, do they really even have a grievance? Do they have a means to go about doing this other than protesting? So I'm not a scholar on the Constitution of the Netherlands or the EU in general, but from doing my research, I pulled up the Constitution of the Netherlands and the structure of the EU and how things happen. And I'm going to summarize it and give you an idea of how they were able to come to how the government basically came to make these decisions. And really, they are not doing anything illegal, in my opinion. It's immoral, but by the laws that they have enacted and the people of the Netherlands have consented to, they really don't have a means to seek justice in this. So the the Constitution of the Netherlands is very different than the Constitution of the United States. It's basically just a list of articles that list out all of the rights that you have, and specifically in Article 14, it's called expropriation may take place only in the public interest and on prior assurance of full compensation in accordance with regulation laid down or pursuant to the Act of Parliament. So that is pretty similar to what we have. It has just compensation. But if you understand the way the government of the Netherlands is set up, there's no judiciary. There's just two legislative bodies, and then they actually have a monarch still. So if the legislative branch passes a law and the king, the executive signs off on it, it is now a law. And if you think that you have not been justly compensated, you have no means to seek a resolution to the judiciary. You don't have a judiciary branch reviewing those laws and to see like, hey, this actually violates the Constitution. This wasn't just compensation. This law violates a higher, natural law, your inalienable rights. There's none of that. And the Constitution doesn't spell it out. It just goes right into articles. So the Netherlands, when they joined the EU, all of these countries consented to be a part of this larger body that has, there's an EU Commission, there's different legislative bodies within the EU, and they send and so people will, there's appointed and then elected officials that go from each country to the EU. So if the people of the Netherlands elect different officials whose interests lie in, let's say, lowering carbon emissions, they can then appoint officials who are on the EU commissions, these EU commissions that can go in and say, yeah, we definitely want to lower carbon emissions. And all these countries are going to do it because the legislative bodies within the EU have passed this as a resolution. These different countries have agreed to it through these treaties. So now they're going to abide by it. and that's a complicated way of saying, and there's a lot more to it, and I may have butchered it a little bit and been hard to understand. But the point I want to make is the people of the Netherlands have gone through multiple different times and consented to their rights being given up to the EU.
Hmm.
They have said, basically, we are going to forfeit some of our rights to this larger body, and our government, the government that we have set up, we don't have these checks and balances that, say, the Americans have. So the Dutch farmers who are now being deprived of what they would say is their livelihood and not being justly compensated have a very difficult time of seeking any sort of justice short of protesting.
Right.
So, what do you think of the summary, Jay?
Yeah. As I'm listening to you talk, the I'm reminded of the correlation between the more we empower the government to take action, regardless of what we want them to take action about, just taking action in general, the more we are losing our rights, right? And the more at a future, the more uncertain it becomes how the government will handle those freedoms that we've turned over to to them. I recall hearing once, I don't remember from where, but I think I either read or somebody said every law that is passed is a restriction on freedom, a restriction on liberty. Like by nature, if it's a law, it's a restriction on your liberty. Um, I don't know if I agree with that because constitutional amendments are part of the law and blah blah blah. But I think generally speaking, the principle is true here in that the Europe uh, had all the best intentions of forming the European Union. Post World War II, it was a time of Europe has literally spent millennia fighting amongst one another, and since World War II, that has by and large stopped. I mean, there's been there's the Balkans, there's it's probably the big
Russia,
one, but
Ukraine.
Russia, Ukraine, Turkey's gets a little um, riled up from time to time. The Greece, you name it. Anyway, there's exceptions to the rule, but like World War II hasn't happened again, and millions of people have died in that. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is like I'm not trying to say abolish the EU. I don't think that that's our opinion here, but it's one of those. It's a consequence when Europeans empowered a government to take action. They have surrendered certain rights, and 50 years hence, we may not know how that turns out. And I think this is an instance where this this is a good example of liberty is not deprived, our freedom isn't taken away uh instantaneously. It's a
Hmm.
slow it's a slow process. I'm gonna throw out some nerdy quote here, but I love it. Uh, to kind of date myself, what probably my favorite movie experience of my life was going to see Star Wars Episode One: The Phantom Menace
A true classic.
as a child. And that movie got so much hate. I don't know if it's my favorite of all the Star Wars, but it's excellent. Darth Maul's definitely the best villain in all of them. And Padme, Natalie Portman's character, says one of the best political quotes of all time in any movie when when Palpatine comes to power. She says, "This is how." I think she says, "This is how democracy dies." To thunderous applause.
Was
And
that in the
that,
Phantom? I think I'm going to correct you historically. Was that the
dude,
Phantom
let's Google
Menace?
this. Let's Google this. I thought it was.
I
Yeah.
Was it the Phantom Menace or was that the Clone Wars? Because I thought it was the Clone Wars where he enacted all that power because there's a crisis, and he was like, "There's a crisis. I need more power,"
I'm
and
Googling it.
everyone consented. Google it real quick, but
Oh, it's in episode 3. Oh shoot. We're both wrong.
Wow. It's been too long since, you know what, the prequels get a lot of hate, like you said, but who would have thought there's some political nuance and some things you can learn? Yeah. It- I think the point you're trying to make, though, is that the people consented to this, what we would say is tyrannical. A-
Yeah,
And it happens so slow. Nobody would have thought 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago that this is where they would be, but here they are. And I think that's why it's important to have these checks and balances, because there may be things, there's unintended consequences for your actions that you may not know. And it's your grandchildren or your great grandchildren that have to bear the weight of that decision. And that's what you have. The EU does not have power in and of itself. It's not like they have a Napoleon coming in and just taking over and dictating to countries. The only power the EU has is given to it through treaties that the countries agree to.
right,
That's it. And every country was like, you know what? This carbon emission things, we agree. And I'm sure that 20 years ago, a lot of these farmers were like, yeah, we want to protect the environment. Climate change is a big deal. We want to protect the environment. And fast forward a few years, and here they are. And now they suddenly don't like that decision. And it's really hard to rectify that.
right.
20 years later, once you consent to it and give it up, it's hard to get those back. Were you going to read the Padme quote?
Well, I was just going to issue some corrections here. It's funny how things blur together when you're a kid, but so she says, "This is how liberty dies," with thunderous
Mm,
applause. So liberty,
mm,
and I do. This is Google. Googling questions is awesome. So you know how like Google brings up this auto list of questions. So it's like,
hmm
who said this is how liberty dies? To a thunderous applause. Next question: what does Padme say when she's dying? Third question: does Padme have Stockholm syndrome? Next question: is Padme a liberal?
when in reality,
I,
she's has a lot of the same ideology that our founders would have had. It's a paradigm shift.
yes, Padme Amidala is a liberal.
A liberal monarch.
That's awesome. Hey, anyway, uh, yeah. So we have what is it, Colin? Approximately 3% of our listeners are from the Netherlands. Is that where we're at?
Yeah, we have a
Something like
strong
that.
following.
Hey, for all of our Dutch folks, if we've gotten something wrong, please let us know. The email us, comment, send a carrier pigeon, like let us know. We don't want to mislead the public here. If there's some kind of nuance that we missed out on, please let us know. Or any of our European listeners for that matter. If you see the EU or something differently, please let us know.
Yeah, and I think the point of what I was trying to say and what we've been talking about is not, well, getting the process right. It's really the fundamentals of, if you are going to consent to something, you need to understand the long-term consequences of it. And first off, I'll be honest, I agree with the Dutch farmers that I think that their livelihood is being unjustly taken, and I disagree with why it's being done. I just wish that the Dutch had a stronger constitution to protect them in the first place. And I think that's why it's so important that whether you're an American or whether you are one of our international listeners, it's important to understand these. And we have tied it to the US Constitution, but the US Constitution inspired revolutions across the world.
Right.
And I think it is still, it can be a beacon of freedom. Whatever your definition of freedom is, but it can still be a beacon. It's say you can look to it and say, hey, you know what? They have something that I like, and maybe we should bring that and implement it here.
Yeah, sorry. I was
So
just
it
thinking
it
of all
is.
the ways that we've looked to the Dutch for inspiration, but I don't know if I actually.
I mean, great wooden shoes.
Great wooden shoes.
No, I
Some
kid.
ships. Uh,
Yeah, great shipbuilding. Actually, it's a funny story. I think Peter the Great from Russia, kind of tying it back to our first series. I think when he visited the Netherlands, he like wanted to stay and be a ship. He was
oh
so
yeah,
he
that's
like
right.
loved the ships there. Yeah, I I, I just think it'd be funny seeing this giant 6'8" Russian out there on like the out in the building ships with the Dutch and being like, yeah, no, I'm just a lowly peasant, Russian
Yeah.
peasant out here visiting.
Hey, there. Back in the age of sail, the Dutch definitely were punching way above their weight class for about 100 years. They were a bigger economic powerhouse than the Brits. there for quite a long time.
Hmm.
And they helped finance the revolution. There's a great scene in the HBO series John Adams that I don't like how, when I think it's Adams. Yeah, Adams goes to the Dutch and he's basically asking for money. And HBO depicts them as like they're all wearing all black. They all seem angry. And it's just like this real dismal scene. I'm like, that's not what I think of when I think of the Dutch, like these stingy old, like mercantile men that loan out money.
Think of tulips.
Yeah, tulips.
Fields of tulips.
Yeah, nice people.
So, all right, Jay, I think that concludes our topic, our episode on property rights. Just to summarize what we talked about, within the U.S. Constitution, there are certain protections within the 5th and 14th Amendment that protect our right to private property because, as the founders believed, private property was essential for all the other rights. And protecting that against government overreach and tyranny would essentially not only protect our property rights, but our other rights as well. And then tying that into the international news and what's happening in the Netherlands, and other countries can be used as an example as well, but we use the Netherlands, and the idea that consenting to giving up rights like private property and decisions to the government that can affect your private property, they can have long-term consequences, and you have to think generationally in order to protect your liberty. And that's really why having checks and balances are important, because it can prevent against that. So you're not paying the consequences decades later, potentially. So to all the Dutch farmers listening out there, I actually do support you, and I believe that you do have a legitimate grievance. Hopefully, this issue is resolved, and the government, your government, does acquiesce to your right to private property. And if you're listening to us on Spotify, please click support, give us a rating, download. And if you're listening on any other means like Apple Podcast, Podcast Addict, click on in our description is a link to our Patreon page. We love your support on Patreon. That's what keeps us ad free, and just to keep on rolling through and get to the good stuff, so you don't have to listen to some silly ad. You can also follow us on social media. We have an Instagram page. We just started a Twitter. We have Facebook. So please give us a like. Come support us on social media. And feel free to interact with Jay and I. You have direct access to us through our Patreon page. We'd love to hear from you. If we got something wrong or there's something you want to hear about, hey, we want to listen to you. We want to give you a shout out and talk about it on the next episode potentially. And speaking of the next episode, next week we're going to be talking about freedom of speech and why that is important. And it's such a hot button issue in today's climate, between big tech, big government, movements throughout the world. Free speech is absolutely essential. And Jay and I are going to break it down from both an American and an international perspective. So thank you, everyone, and have a good week.